Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in China in the past 24 hours. We start in the Middle East and the maritime system that underpins global energy flows. China is now actively pushing for rapid normalization of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, framing itself as a stabilizing force in a moment where global supply chains are still sensitive to disruption. Beijing's messaging is focused on three things: locking in a ceasefire environment in the region, restoring uninterrupted maritime transit, and supporting the idea of a new regional security structure led by Middle Eastern states rather than external powers. This is not just diplomatic language. It's China positioning itself inside the core infrastructure of global energy security, right at the choke point where even small disruptions can ripple through global inflation, shipping costs, and industrial supply chains. And while that messaging is being delivered, oil flows are already restarting in parts, with tankers moving through the strait and heading toward Asian markets. So you've got diplomacy and physical trade activity moving at the same time, reinforcing each other. Now shift over to Taiwan, where the pressure environment is becoming more layered and more operational. Taiwan is openly acknowledging that warning time for a potential Chinese military contingency is shrinking. That is a major shift in tone coming from defense leadership. The implication is simple but serious. The buffer between routine Chinese military activity and potential escalation is getting thinner. In response, Taiwan is reshaping its training posture around immediate combat readiness. These drills are designed to test whether forces can shift rapidly from peacetime posture into active defense without the traditional buildup periods that militaries prefer. And this is happening while Chinese maritime and air activity continues around the island, including Coast Guard operations and survey activity off Taiwan's eastern waters. Beijing frames these actions as lawful enforcement tied to sovereignty. Taiwan and its partners interpret them as incremental pressure designed to normalize presence and compress response time. At the same time, the diplomatic layer around Taiwan is expanding beyond the island itself. The U.S. has begun actively warning that Chinese diplomatic missions are engaging state-level governments and private companies in the U.S. to discourage engagement with Taiwan. That pushes this beyond traditional state-to-state diplomacy and into domestic economic and political space. It's a subtle but important evolution in how influence is being applied. And then you've got Western coordination showing up more clearly. Several European countries, alongside the U.S., have raised concerns about Chinese maritime activity near Taiwan's eastern waters. Beijing, for its part, is rejecting those concerns and doubling down on the argument that these are legitimate jurisdictional operations under international law. So you now have two competing narratives running in parallel. One focused on sovereignty and enforcement, the other focused on regional stability and freedom of navigation. Now let's move into the technology front, where the US-China competition is accelerating in a very direct way. One of the major US AI firms has accused Alibaba-linked operators of running large-scale extraction activity against advanced AI systems. The core concern is not just commercial copying, but systematic probing designed to replicate high-level model behavior at scale. We're talking millions of interactions intended to map reasoning patterns, task execution, and decision structures in advanced systems. The strategic implication is straightforward. If those behaviors can be extracted efficiently, then the cost barrier between frontier AI systems and secondary systems drops significantly. That compresses the advantage held by leading US firms. Alibaba has responded on a completely different front, taking the U.S. Department of Defense to court over its designation as a company linked to China's military ecosystem. The company is arguing reputational damage and disputing any operational connection to military procurement structures. But the broader context here is important. The U.S. is drawing sharper lines around which firms are considered part of a dual-use or military-adjacent technology environment, while Chinese firms are increasingly challenging those classifications in court rather than purely through diplomatic channels. So what you're seeing is the tech competition moving into legal systems, regulatory frameworks, and AI capability security all at once. This is no longer just export controls and chip restrictions. It's now also about model behavior, data access, and who gets to define what counts as military-linked technology. Now zoom out to financial and influence networks. Because China's footprint is expanding in ways that don't always sit in the headline military category, but matter strategically over time. In Georgia, a major bank acquisition by a Chinese conglomerate has raised concerns about access to sensitive financial and identity data. This institution isn't marginal. It handles pensions, welfare payments, and services a large portion of the population. That means the underlying data exposure goes beyond banking transactions into demographic and behavioral data sets tied directly to citizens and state payments. When you combine that with China-linked participation in cross-border financial systems and yuan-based clearing channels, you get a parallel financial architecture that increases structural influence without traditional coercion. In Southeast Asia, Thai authorities have issued an arrest warrant tied to a Chinese businessman connected to illegal crypto mining and alleged laundering operations tied to fraud networks. These operations sit inside a broader ecosystem of scam-driven financial flows that have become highly industrialized, often operating across borders with fragmented enforcement environments. Crypto mining and digital asset movement act as both cover and infrastructure for those flows. Now bring in the military and doctrinal layer, because underneath all of this external activity, China is still working through internal questions about how its military actually fights. Recent PLA writings focus heavily on what they call battlefield execution. At its core, this is about whether higher-level operational intent can be translated into coordinated action across services, domains, and logistics systems. The PLA is actively trying to improve joint operations capability, logistics resilience, and command flexibility. But there is a persistent tension running through it: how to give enough autonomy to commanders in fast-moving scenarios without weakening centralized political control. That tension becomes especially relevant when you consider China's long-term modernization goal around 2027. A lot of current doctrine, training reform, and logistics restructuring is being aligned to that benchmark. But even internal military writing suggests capability gaps remain, particularly in joint operations integration and real-time coordination under realistic combat conditions. On the military diplomacy side, China continues to expand visible coordination with Russia through naval engagements, including recent task force visits to Russian ports. These are not high-intensity combat operations, but they do reinforce operational familiarity between the two navies and signal sustained strategic alignment in maritime domains. And in terms of broader force signaling, China's naval activity in the Western Pacific continues to generate frequent close encounters with U.S. and allied forces, particularly around carrier operations and patrol cycles. These interactions are becoming routine rather than exceptional, which matters because normalization of contact increases the risk of miscalculation even when neither side intends escalation. There are also continued tensions in the South China Sea, where China's maritime presence and infrastructure positioning remain points of friction with regional states. These are less about single incidents and more about sustained pressure patterns tied to long-term control dynamics over contested waters. Thank you for listening and for contributing to the growth of this community. If you found the show valuable, a review or a thoughtful comment helps extend its reach to others. For more in-depth analysis, we publish a daily intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, covering Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Have a great day.